All right, so today we're going to go to episode 2 of the life of Apostle Paul, and we're going to look at his education at the feet of Gamaliel. Now, Gamaliel was a teacher, a Pharisee, a teacher in the temple that was a member of the Sanhedrin Council. He's mentioned a couple different times in the New Testament, and I think I want to start by looking at uh, Paul's transition. We talked about his life in Tarsus and his early childhood education. Around age 5 or 6, he would have started his elementary education studying the Old Testament, prophets, and law in the synagogue there in Tarsus. And then he probably would have started learning his trade of tent making. And by somewhere between 8, 9, 10 years old, he would have transitioned into more what we would consider a middle school education. He would study the mitzvah, and he probably would have transitioned out of working in a shop, making tents, to going with his father to the marketplace and learning how to interact with people in the marketplace. So he's growing up. At the age of 12, he would become accountable to the law, and then when Passover came after that, he would go to the temple there in Jerusalem to participate in the offering of a sacrifice. And so I was going to let me start with this timeline, and we're going to look at right here. He was born, I got a marker on. So he was born in Tarsus, and we know he was a Roman citizen, born a Roman citizen. He was born a Pharisee because his father was a Pharisee. And so we have here his school education. We know he learned Hebrew and Aramaic. Pharisees would have been required to know that. He had to know Greek to interact in the marketplace, and he had to know Latin to be a Roman citizen. And then, of course, he would have done his tent making. And so, and then here he advances in the school year and goes to work in the marketplace. And so this is kind of where we're at. And then we come to this line here where at age 12 he goes to Jerusalem. And one of the things that I wanted to point out was that there's no record of this, of him going to Jerusalem. Now, we know that his teenage years he was educated by Gamaliel in the temple, and so I think it's obvious that he went to Jerusalem at 12 years old. There is a record of Jesus going to the temple at 12 years old, and so I was going to just review his education here. It was divided into segments. So the first two were early childhood. This would have been like elementary and middle school education. They would study the Old Testament, law, prophets, and Psalms, and then they would study the Mishnah. And then at 12, they would go, they would become accountable to the law. At 13, they would study the mitzvah, the commandments and precepts. And then at 15, they would complete their study by memorizing the Talmud. So this is like elementary school, middle school, junior high school, if you want to look at it kind of like a modern day education terms. So the last two segments would have taken place in Jerusalem. One other thing, too, I just kind of guessed. Most scholars put Paul's birth around 1 BC to 10 BC. And and most scholars put Jesus' birth somewhere around 4 BC. So I don't know if Paul was before or after Jesus. I don't know that. I just made it 1 BC to do the math here. Now, I do know for sure that by 46 AD is when he went out on his first missionary journey. So all of this happened by that point in time. And I also expect that he was probably around 70 when he died. And so that number takes us to about the time that he was beheaded here. So we're going to use 1 BC as that marker. This is the account in Luke when Jesus went to the temple. It says he was 12 years old. He went to the festival of Passover according to the custom, like I say, all Hebrew boys did after they turned 12. After the festival was over, while his parents returned home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. After 3 days, they found him in the temple court, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding. I put this in here because I think it's possible. If Jesus was sitting here for 3 days talking to teachers in the temple, it's very likely that Gamaliel heard him at some point, maybe even spoke to the young boy Jesus. So let's look a little bit about Gamaliel just so we kind of have a better understanding of who he is. He was a leading authority in the Sanhedrin Council in the first century. Of course, I discussed in a prior video, the Sanhedrin Council was the Jewish court. So you had 70 members plus the high priest who kind of oversaw activities of the court. But 35 members would have been Pharisees, 35 members would have been Sadducees. And so it's kind of broken down like that. So it's almost like a two-party system. Gamaliel is recognized as the Pharisee doctor of Jewish law in the Talmud. He is described as bearing the titles Nasi and Rabban, which means our master. Gamaliel holds a reputation in the Mishnah for being one of the greatest teachers in all the annals of Judaism. So, I mean, he was a highly respected, well-known, very educated man. He may have held a senior position in the Sanhedrin. I really don't know how the positions broke down, but I expect each side had its leaders. Gamaliel was mentioned in Acts 5:34 as a man of great honor by all Jews who spoke not to condemn the apostles of Jesus during the trial of Peter and the other apostles. And of course, after the church was started, Peter and John were arrested. Peter and some other apostles were arrested, and they brought them to the Sanhedrin Council. And here in Acts, we read this account. It says the high priest rose up, which would have been the head of the Sanhedrin Council, and all those who were with him, and they were filled with indignation, laid their hands on the apostles and put them in common prison. At night, the angel of the Lord opened the doors and brought them out, and the high priest and the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard, and they wondered. And so one came and told them, saying, "Look, these men that you put in prison are standing in the temple teaching the people." And the captain of the guard, which was the like a military police division of the Sanhedrin, the captain and the officers went and brought them before the council of the Sanhedrin, and the high priest asked him, saying, "Didn't we strictly command you not to teach in his name?" But Peter and the apostles answered and said, "We ought to obey God rather than men." And this is where you're going to see Gamaliel stand up. It says, when they heard this, they were furious and plotted to kill them. And one in the council stood up, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law held in respect by all people, and commanded them to put the apostles outside for a little while. And he said, "Men of Israel, take heed to yourself that what you intend to do regarding these men. And now I say, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan is a work of men, it will come to nothing. If it is of God, you cannot overthrow it, lest you be found to fight against God." And so we see here that this is another reason I think Gamaliel may have been here listening to this boy Jesus. He may have heard him speak, and there may have been something inside him that was perplexed about this young man and how all these followers that he had, was he really of God? He couldn't say for sure. And so he made this argument for the apostles, and all the Sanhedrin agreed with him. So he definitely had some great influence. When they had called for the apostles, they beat them and commanded them they should not speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. So the book of Acts later goes on to describe the Apostle Paul recounting as, although born in Tarsus, he was brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel and taught according to perfect manner of the law of the fathers. So there he was taught by him. The Talmud describes Gamaliel as teaching a student who displayed impudence and learning, which is few scholars identify as a possible reference to Paul. That may even have been a reference to Jesus if he did indeed see him at some point in his life. And so that would have bring us here where he was educated at the feet of Gamaliel and finished his education by memorizing the Talmud. Now, after his education under the feet of Gamaliel, he would have settled in to work as a Pharisee. And I put here that maybe at the temple of the freedmen or freedmen, I want to look at a couple things here. First, this is a picture. This is outskirts of Washington, D.C. and Alexandria, Virginia. And I wanted you to look at how these communities are broke down, white, Hispanic, Black, Asian, other. And so you see all these different neighborhoods, how they're broke down by like ethnicity. Jerusalem was very much the same. I talked in a prior video about the dispersion when everybody left Israel, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom and the Babylonians destroyed the southern kingdom, and there was this dispersion. Well, after the Romans restarted allowed them to restart the sacrifice, people started moving back to Jerusalem, and so there was this filling up of the city. And in Acts 9, it says there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the libertines, which is liberty or freedmen, freedom men. So it's kind of all the same thing. But this is the synagogue where all this stuff took place. And it says, now the libertines were people taken captive by Pompey to Greece, and they were later released and came back. But here you have Cretians from the island of Crete, Alexandrians from the Greek areas, and then people from Cilicia, which is where Paul was from, and of Asia. And so all these people were people of this synagogue, the synagogue of libertines. And so you get this picture, and I think I had some notes here. Now this says Saul of Cilicia was doubtless a member of it. I don't know if it's doubtless. I say it's very probable that he was a member of it. And so you see on this map, here's Tarsus, and they were in Jerusalem. Well, here's the island of Crete. This is, of course, Cilicia and Asia. In here, this would have been Greece, the Alexandrians, and then the libertines would have been from Rome. And so that's where all of them came from. And so when we look next week, we'll start looking at what was going on at this temple, as Stephen was also from a Greek community. So Stephen was serving in that synagogue, and we'll look at what happened as we get to the point where Stephen's death and Paul's introduction into the New Testament comes into being. So we've covered this part of Paul's life, his childhood, his education, his arrival in Jerusalem, and then next week we'll look at more of this interaction between Stephen and this synagogue of the freedmen, the libertine synagogue. And so that's what we'll look at next week. I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time. All right. Well, God bless you.